up Maia, and she is going to come up and lead us through our next session. So Maia graduated from Mines in 2020 with her bachelor's in chemical and biochemical engineering. She's held internships with companies such as Halliburton and Enro, and immediately after graduation, she began working with Invitae in Boulder, Colorado. While at Mines, Maia was heavily involved on campus. I think she would have been sitting in this room had she been a student at the time. By her senior year, she served as Mac's E-Days chair during so she's legit. She was a charter member of the Peer Educator program. Any peer educators in the house? Yeah, all right. And a member of exec for Pi Beta Phi. Do we have any Pi Phis in the room? All right. Maia was also a recipient of what's now known as the Dan Fox Outstanding Student Service Award for her graduating class, which is kind of a big deal. While Maia now works as a project engineer for Barry-Wehmiller Design Group in Lakewood, Colorado, she still finds her extracurriculars to be fulfilling. So all this extracurricular stuff you're doing now is something indeed you can keep doing after college. In Maia's spare time, she does freelance work as a graphic designer and occasional photographer. Most notably, this is pretty cool, she started a podcast in May 2023 entitled, Well, I Laughed, with a friend turned co-host, Grant Thomas. Well, I Laughed averages around 40,000 monthly listeners, so y'all can be downloading or following her podcast and join that. Well, hopefully that number will go up after today's session, and has quickly become a really large part of Maia and Grant's lives, much to their surprise. So please join me in welcoming Maia to her talk, and we'll get her slides up here and we'll get rolling.
Hi. So as Braylon Lovely introduced me, my name is Maia Warner, and I don't speak publicly all the time, so I'm probably not as polished as our other speakers are going to be today, but I would still love to tell you guys how I got to stand up here right now, and some of what I've learned about leadership over the last couple of years and since I've graduated, and including my time in college. So when I was asked to be a speaker at Leadership Summit, I'm not going to lie, I was absolutely thrilled. I am a Mines alum, obviously, so I did attend a lot of these leadership summits, and I even helped plan them at one point. So being invited to speak really felt full circle for me. And being Gen Z, I crave external validation, as I'm sure a lot of you can relate to. And so knowing the people that I'd worked with closely at Mines had seen my career after graduation and had thought that I was successful or cool enough to speak here was really validating. But then very quickly anxiety set in because what the hell do I talk about? I graduated in 2020. But I am a yes and kind of person, so I just kind of told myself that I would figure it out along the way, and that I did. I actually have a lot more written down than I thought I would, so we're going to run quickly. So in trying to write this speech, I went to my Google Drive and started jotting down some notes, but I came across this untitled document, and I'm very type A, as I'm sure most of you in this room are, so it's very rare for me to leave documents untitled and unsorted, so this was a strange thing to come upon, and I opened it thinking I might have left a stroke of genius in there. And this is absolutely true. I am not lying to you to make this up for the sake of the speech. This is what that document said, and I actually burst out laughing. It was hilarious that I had written this at some point and I'd left it then to age in my drive, but as I'm giving a speech in part about who I am, it kind of felt like a crazy time to come upon this. And so I asked myself, who am I? Which I'm sure you guys are going to ask me, so.
Who are you?
Thank you so much, I'm so happy to tell you. My name is Maia Warner. I graduated from Mines in 2020 with a degree in chemical and biochemical engineering. Currently, I work at an engineering consulting firm that's based out of St. Louis, but has offices all across the country. We work closely with a lot of big name clients like Anheuser-Busch, Intel, Tesla, and so many more. My main project right now is with Pepsi. I'm working on Project Mustang, which is Pepsi's new 280,000 square foot plant out by DIA. And the scope of this project is pretty insane. They're basically doubling their production capacity. They're relocating all of their lines that are at their Denver plant and then adding about that same equivalent of lines to this new facility. And my official title is project engineer. And I didn't know what that meant when graduating, and I'm sure a lot of you feel the same way. When people ask me what project engineering means, because it is super vague, oftentimes I can't really figure out what to tell them, so I just say yes or everything, and that's true. My job is to understand enough of the technical side and manage the big picture between my clients and their oftentimes incredibly unrealistic goals. And I'm one step below a PM, so if that gives you an idea of what a project engineer actually is. So now that I've told you what my professional career looks like, you might be asking yourself, what can she possibly teach me? She's not even in a leadership role or a job, and she's only, 25? So what kinds of leadership opportunities could she have possibly had that I can learn from? And don't get me wrong, I have a lot of imposter syndrome standing here right now. So be nice. But the theme of today's event is forging your path. And forging your own path does not need to happen in your professional career. Forging your own path means intentionally investing in yourself in the areas where it matters the most to you. And that in and of itself requires a leadership mindset. So leadership is not just about being a PM. It's not just about being a team lead or a CEO. Leadership qualities are something that are ever present and are exhibited in and outside of leadership roles. So let me tell you a little bit about how I got here. So I was born and raised in Colorado, and I'm not gonna lie, I say that mostly to brag because I'm assuming I'm one of maybe a handful of people born and raised in Colorado. Can I see a show of hands? Never mind, okay, moving on. Not as cool as I thought. So I'm happy that you guys are all from here. So I grew up not far from here in Arvada, and I grew up with crippling shyness, as you might be able to tell by these incredible pictures of me from when I was young. Just to kind of give you an example of how shy I was, my parents always wanted to get a picture of me with Santa Claus while I was young and cute. And unfortunately for them, the idea of approaching a stranger and then not only approaching that stranger, but then sitting in their lap was absolutely ridiculous to me. And so they never got that picture. They got a picture of me with them, with Santa and me screaming and crying. And I couldn't find those pictures, but this is a picture I could find of me with Mickey, and you can see just about how distressed I am. Although that Mickey is pretty terrifying. I might look like that now if I took a picture with him. But trends like these carried on throughout high school. I have really vivid memories of breaking out sweating and shaking every time I had to speak aloud in class or when someone would say hi to me in the hallway that I didn't know. And then I would relive those experiences for hours afterwards to see if there was any way that I might have embarrassed myself. And so for that reason, I'm very glad that there's truth to the quote from Vince Lombardi that leaders aren't born, they are made. And so before we get into the bulk of what I want to talk to you about today, I want to start with a quick activity. So if everyone could get a piece of paper to write on and a pen, and we're going to move relatively quickly through these exercises. So I want you to kind of have a gut reaction or a gut response to what I'm asking you to do. I want you to write down the name of one person you think is a leader, a great leader. Preferably, this is someone you know, but if not, it can be someone you know of or a public figure. So go ahead. Under that person's name, I want you to list a few, maybe one or two qualities of that person that you think make them a good leader. Think about why that person has had an impact on you. Why was that your response when I asked you to write the name of a great leader? And when you've done that, I want you to please share with someone at your table. So it seems like there's a common thread of being on top of their jobs, but also being a caring individual. Does that seem like a good summarization? Awesome. So I asked you to do that, so it's only fair that I give you my response. But in order to understand the full scope of why this person is a great leader to me, I need to explain some of my history to you. So I have always struggled with mental health, but I'm sure like many of you guys here, it wasn't something that my parents talked about openly or my family talked about, so it went untreated for a really long time. And there was an early instance where my mental health issues presented themselves was in the 6th grade, and before we talk about it, that's what I looked like, maybe. So you know when you're taking a quiz in class and you're done with the quiz and the teacher asks you to flip the quiz over and wait for everyone else to be done? Has everyone had that experience? Yeah, so this had happened, and my teacher also encouraged us to doodle on the back of our sheets. It was 6th grade, so, and that's what I did, but I also scribbled some notes on the back, and I hadn't really thought anything of it at the time, but my teacher had read that and had flagged it for further discussion with my parents. And honestly, I couldn't tell you what I wrote on the back of that sheet, and I can't really remember the outcome of that meeting with my parents, but I can tell you that my teacher at the time was concerned about my mental health and that nothing really came of that situation, and things really continued on as usual. Looking back on it, this wasn't the first time I'd felt this way, but it definitely was the first time I had kind of intentionally given out a cry for help. So I went on into high school and my mental health decreased as my teenage angst increased, which is a joke, but you get the idea. My mental health worsened. I struggled with self-harm and suicidal ideation, and for a period of time in high school. If I had been given the opportunity when I was young, I could have already had some of the resources to understand my mental health before it had gotten to this really critical state. So now that I'm standing here, I know that I have major depressive disorder, general anxiety, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. And as I like to call the three, they're the mental health trifecta. If you know, you know. Unfortunately, though, it took until my sophomore year at Mines until someone close to me recognized my symptoms for something more serious and recommended that I get help. And it took a while, because admitting that you need help is never easy, and that's something that I think all of you can relate to. Every Mines student learns that after their first physics or chemistry test. But I did. I finally got the help that I needed, and I started medications and cognitive behavioral therapy. And while I'm so glad now that I took this step, it was definitely a tough adjustment, and like all kinds of medications, mental health medications take a bit of a trial and error period to find the cocktail that works for you. And so for this reason, it took me a while to adjust to the new medications and finding the right ones. I was also trying to balance the coursework at Mines, my extracurriculars, my jobs, and so I was tired. I was so tired that I was like struggling to stay awake during the day. So being tired wasn't new for me, but I did recognize that this was worse, but I didn't really connect it to the mental health medications that I was on. So while I was at Mines, back to kind of who my leader is, I served on the Mines Activities Council. Yeah. If anyone here doesn't know what MAC is, they're the event planning governing board. They're responsible for things like E-Days, homecoming, and movie nights. And as part of that council, we had weekly meetings with our advisor, who was Kelsey Strike at the time. So who is a leader I admire? The short answer is Kelsey. Don't look at me like that, you're gonna make me cry. When I worked under her, she facilitated MAC's internal relationships with one another, was always willing to answer our questions, and encouraged our our creativity, of course within reason, because there were some moments we definitely needed to be pulled down to earth. She has a magnetism that makes you want to work with her, and she also has this uncanny ability to be able to lead people to understand things about themselves that they never considered. And even now that I'm not her job, she still surprises me with how much she understands everyone around her. Luckily, that still includes me. So even while doing all of this, she also did her best to ensure that every event with Mac's name on it ended up being something that we were proud of. And those are all reasons I admire Kelsey's leadership, but here's a moment that I really realized how much I appreciated her leadership style. So in one of these one-on-ones, I was telling Kelsey that I was tired, and like really tired, and she turned to me and asked me something really simple. She asked me if I was taking my new medications in the morning and if it would make me drowsy. And that should have been really obvious to me, but it wasn't. And so it suddenly made so much sense. And I remember this so vividly because it made me realize that Kelsey not only cared about the team and our success as a team, but also as me as an individual. It showed me that she listened and internalized our previous conversations. She remembered that I had recently started this journey. And she also recognized that this sleepiness I was experiencing was not normal. And I think about this all the time because Kelsey taught me that understanding the people that you lead is crucial not only to them as a person, but to the team as a whole. And so empathy is incredibly important in leadership. So here's an industry example of that leadership, or of that empathy. So the job that I work at now, Barry-Wehmiller Design Group, we call it BWDG for short. I got that job offer after my spring career fair at my senior year, but I graduated in 2020, and as we all know, COVID hit, and so that job offer was actually rescinded in March of 2020 because the company went on a hiring freeze. So obviously the story ends up going well because I got that job offer re-extended to me a year later, and I work for them now, but when I started, I found out that they had gone on a hiring freeze in order to prioritize the employees that they already had and to make sure that they didn't need to lay anyone off. And I thought that that was great that they did that, but it doesn't end there. On one of my first days in the office, I saw this display of a book called The Extraordinary Power of Caring for Your People Like Family by Bob Chapman. And Bob Chapman is the CEO of our parent company, Barry-Wehmiller. So I did a little bit of Googling, because why would my CEO, who is the CEO of primarily a manufacturing firm, write a book like this? And I soon found the reason. So in 2008, as you all know, we went through a recession. And the global economy suffered, unemployment in the US doubled, and companies laid off employees to stay afloat. During this time, BW lost 30% of their orders, and the company needed to save money. Specifically, over this next year, they needed to save about $10 million. The board of directors kind of decided that they needed to do layoffs, so they brought this up with Bob, and Bob refused. He said, "We're not letting anyone go, we're finding another solution." So they devised a furlough program where every employee would be required to take a certain amount of unpaid leave throughout the year, and this way they could still save the money. And when Bob announced this to the company, he said, "It's better that we should all suffer a little than any of us suffer a lot." And obviously, when everyone heard this, the morale went up, shockingly, because they knew that their job was safe, and employees felt seen and cared for by their leadership. And employees actually began to take care of one another during this time of crisis. They began trading furloughed time with one another. So the people that could afford to take more unpaid leave took it, so that those who couldn't afford it didn't have to take as much. And the company ended up saving $20 million while keeping everyone employed. When those you work for know you have their back, they'll not only feel inclined to reciprocate that care and respect, but they're also going to be more likely to treat others with that same care and respect and be more motivated to work well for you. So when I was sitting in Kelsey's office for that one-on-one, Kelsey realized that what I needed was to feel cared for and supported. I was new in the sphere of mental health treatment, and in truth, I was still pretty embarrassed about it. In my head, it felt great to understand the reason for the way that I was feeling and to understand that it wasn't inconsequential, that I shouldn't be able to necessarily fix myself. And once my doctor and I started finding the right medications and the therapy started taking effect, and I started to learn how to feel emotionally regulated, I also started to learn how to like myself for maybe the first time in my life. And I thought to myself, is this how people always feel? Like, do you guys have that much serotonin all the time? Once I realized that this normalcy had been within my grasp for so long, I got mad and I got really frustrated. Why are discussions around mental health so stigmatized? If discussion about mental health hadn't been so stigmatized and I had understood it better, would I have been able to get the care that I needed earlier? And at this point, I realized that this was going to be a passion of mine, that this is going to be something that I wanted to change and make an impact on. So the question became, how can I help others who might be feeling the same way I did? And what can I actively work towards to make an impact on how those around me see mental health? So I wanted to start doing that, but there was honestly a lot of growth that needed to happen in myself before I was going to be able to offer help to others. One of the big areas of growth came with acknowledging my strengths, and most importantly, not just acknowledging my weaknesses, but accepting them. So back to MAC, because it was a huge part of my life for so long. MAC is a very tight-knit community. There's only about 9 to 10 members who plan all of those events. And so part of being on that team is having a good relationship with those on your team and being a good member of that team. So we did a lot of team building exercises. And that year, Kelsey asked us to take the CliftonStrengths Finder quiz to identify what our strengths are. And this is a phenomenal quiz, and it's not like other strengths quiz. So you might be asking yourself or looking at me saying, well, I've taken my Myers-Briggs, I know my Enneagrams, and BuzzFeed told me which Twilight character I am, so why would I need another personality test? I'm Anna Kendrick's character, by the way. I did take the test. And I could skip straight to telling you what I learned from the test, but I know what you all are like, that you want to know why something is effective and not just be told that it is. So here is why it's more effective. Here's some of the history. It was developed by this guy, Donald Clifton, in the 90s, and his team wanted to know what qualities make different kinds of people more effective leaders and team members. They interviewed thousands of leaders. They interviewed 1 million teams, 10,000 team members, and analyzed decades of data from Gallup polls. In doing so, they identified some of the practices which make leaders and their teams successful. Importantly, they realized that leaders who were actively striving to be good at everything were the least effective overall. Good leaders were focused on building their existing strengths instead of trying to fix their weaknesses like some leadership models would recommend. So, how does a leader determine what their strengths are? How do they know what to invest in? So Clifton and his team sought to find a solution for this. They wanted to make a test to facilitate this process in a way that hadn't really been done before. Through all their research, they were able to generalize all the areas of strength they saw into 34 total strengths and sort them into 4 main categories: executing, influencing, relationship building, and strategic thinking. So the test is actually rather intimidating to take. It is 177 questions total, and it only gives you 20 seconds to answer each question before you move on. Have some of you guys taken the Gallup Strengths?
Oh yeah.
Hell yeah. So another reason that the test is effective is that it uses ipsative scoring as opposed to normative scoring. And I didn't know what this was, so I had to look it up. A question that would utilize normative scoring would have scaled answers that look like this. So this question uses normative scoring. It has a statement, and you kind of select how much you agree to it. Whereas an ipsative question would look like this. There are 3 different statements, and you select which one is the most true. Ipsative scoring is also known as forced scoring because it makes you pick one. It makes you rank your decisions. And so this is not to say that normative scoring isn't useful. It's definitely useful in comparing an individual to a large group. But it won't tell you as much about yourself as an ipsative test might. So here are the results from my test. In getting the results to this test, Mac all got a chance to acknowledge our own personal strengths and the strengths of others on the team. So this increased each of our own morale, but also made things like delegating and asking questions easier as we got better at internalizing our strengths and recognizing the strengths that other people had that we didn't. It also allowed me to understand why my teammates acted and responded to things like stress in the way they did. It acted as a buffer between me and responding in an irritated or angry manner when they did something that I didn't understand. And I want to make something really clear here. When I talk about weaknesses in the scope of Clifton Strengths, I'm not referring to the strengths that you rank lowest in. I'm referring to what Clifton Strengths refers to as blind spots associated with every strength. Remember, this test is about building your strengths, not fixing your weaknesses. So much like Michael Scott in The Office, when he's interviewed for that position in corporate, he says his weaknesses are actually his strengths, and in this case, that's kind of true. So my top strength was restorative, and this is a problem-solving strength. People with this strength love to solve problems, but a blind spot is that I focus on the process of problem solving and forget to let other people find their own solutions. Another strength that I have is individualization, and this is probably my favorite strength. People with this strength tend to understand the people around them very easily. But a blind spot that I have is that I might know other people more than they know me, and that could be a source of insecurity for me, and thinking that people don't like or don't care about me as much as I think they should. And so I have to remember to communicate openly. The last one that we'll talk about is learner, which is pretty self-explanatory. But a blind spot is that I might get too caught up in the process of learning and forget to care about the outcomes. So with that, I want everyone to pick up their pens one more time. And you're going to write down 3 strengths you perceive in yourself. And Clifton strengths aren't really, they don't make sense as terms, so just list strengths that maybe you have on your resume. I put a list up on the screen if you need a place to go from. I want you guys to pick one of those strengths, one of the 3 that you wrote down. And I want you to write down underneath that, what does that strength mean? What value does that add to you as a team member? And then under that, I want you to write what blind spots you might have with it. Hopefully this exercise helps you feel more confident in your areas of strength and also kind of recognize that other people have strengths that you might not. And I just want to pause and say that Kelsey is actually trained in giving these workshops, so if you're interested and you haven't taken them, Kelsey's back there. There's a quote from Elizabeth Gilbert that actually came as a courtesy from my co-host of my podcast when he read over my speech. And he said he felt like it applies to the dichotomy of your strength and your blind spots. The quote is, "The most peaceful people that I know and the most wise people that I know are the ones who have created enough internal space to be able to allow all the parts of themselves to coexist despite the contradictions." So, back to my personal journey. Come my junior year at Mines, I had a decent grasp of my own power and platform, and I decided at that point that I was going to use whatever I had to aid in the destigmatization of mental health on campus. So what active choices could I make to do this? With respect to MAC, I specifically realized I was particularly well suited to lift up those on campus who wanted to put on events and initiatives for mental health. But the other thing that I started doing, the smaller thing that I started doing that I still do today, is I speak openly about my mental health with those around me. Of course, when it's relevant, not just like shouting into the void. But this could be as simple as like responding to "how are you" by saying "my mental health hasn't been great lately" instead of just saying "I'm fine." And in that way, you open up that conversation about mental health. And in doing this over time, I noticed that more and more people began to approach me and ask genuine questions about my journey with mental health, and even opened up to me about their journeys in return. And a few even opened up to me enough to ask me for advice on how to get that help or to be their accountability partners in getting that help. Little changes like that can have huge impacts. I could have very easily told myself that there are other, more suited people to handle this mental health crisis on campus, but that's falling to the bystander effect. Bystander effect. Is anyone in here familiar with what the bystander effect is? Okay. It actually began as a response to a really horrific crime in New York City, where a woman was brutally killed in a street, surrounded by apartments. This happened in the 60s. And this case wasn't getting a lot of attention in the media until one of those media sources released that at least 37 people had played witness to the murder. And none of them had gone for help. None of them had gone to help her or even called for help. So this phenomenon was pretty fascinating for psychologists, obviously a tragedy, but why did no one respond? Why did no one do anything? And so Bibb Latane and John M. Darley published a study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 1968 to study why this might have happened. Now, I could get into the details of the setup of the study, but frankly, I don't have time. But I do recommend it if you're interested. What's important here are the results. Essentially, they brought one student in at a time. They were told how many other members would be in the study, and they were told that they would be able to anonymously talk. What they were talking about was going to be the problems that they faced adjusting to college life. However, during this experiment, so basically all of the students were in rooms with intercoms, so they didn't actually face one another, and so none of the other members of the study were actually there. They were all pre-recorded. And at one point, over the intercom, an emergency was faked, where one of the students on the other end of the intercom sounded like they were having a seizure or something and calling for help. What Latane and Darley found is that as the perceived study group size increased, the likelihood that the emergency would be reported to the experimenter decreased. They also found that if the participant didn't report the emergency within around 120 seconds, the chances were that it wouldn't go reported at all. And so while I'm not witnessing crimes all the time, this is something that I like to remind myself when I'm tending towards inaction in something that I care about. I ask myself, is this something that I should be a part of? Small changes can make a big impact. You can practice leadership not just as a leader, but as an advocate for others. Although I might not be the best suited to change the stigma surrounding mental health, I can absolutely do what I can to contribute to the solution. So, again, back to my personal journey. By my senior year of MAC, I was the E-Days chair. Every person on MAC chairs a different event or aspect of E-Days, and then the E-Days chair runs the big picture. So this was the first time that I was not only running my responsibilities as my position on MAC, I was also responsible for leading the rest of my team. And while this wasn't my first rodeo, I had worked on 3 E-Days prior to this, I still found myself struggling. How do I draw a line in the sand if someone doesn't live up to my expectations of them? There's one particular member who was just not getting the things done that they needed to, and it was beginning to become a source of tension between us. And this behavior at the time was not normal for this person, so I wanted to get to the source of this interaction. So I scheduled a one-on-one with them, and I wrote down everything I wanted to say beforehand and tried to go into the meeting with an open mind despite how frustrated I was. And it turns out that I had actually said something to him a while back that had rubbed him the wrong way. And the more that they thought about it, the more it irritated them. And they were not motivated to do the work that I had asked them to do because of that. And so we were able to talk about it and apologize to each other. I apologized for what I had said. He apologized for letting it fester and not approaching me sooner. And we were able to adjust how we worked together and best suit how our working relationship would look like moving forward. Self-awareness is really, really key to leadership. So I know that I can be abrasive. I know that I can be too blunt. Sometimes I act or say things that I don't really fully understand the effect of what I've done or said. In the example of Bob Chapman, like I mentioned earlier, making sure your team knows you have their back can be crucial to overall success. When faced with a crisis, they were still able to meet and even exceed their goals, in part due to the care of their employees and people. Success is not mutually exclusive from empathy. You can still care about your people and have success, especially in the face of a crisis. But while I'm no way the leader of MAC, I was in no way the only leader to MAC for eDays 2020, but I do believe that we all knew as a team we had one another's backs and we had an amazing support system. And it turned out ending up serving us because we did face a crisis. As some of you might have put together, I did say eDays 2020. So that same week that I lost my job offer, I also found out that eDays, the event I had been planning since May of 2019, was completely scrapped as it currently was. So this is what it would have looked like. It never happened. But by the time we found out eDays 2020 could not be on campus, we only had, I think it was like a month, maybe 3 weeks to revamp the whole thing. And remember, I had been planning this since May of 2019. So that's a short time to cancel everything that we already had and then redo it. I still mourn the loss of Mythology Days, but I am still so proud to this day of everything that we accomplished in that month. So instead of Mythology Days, we ran virtual reality days. And thanks to the creativity of MAC and our support system, we were able to reimagine it in a way that could work off campus. So instead of live performers, we hosted virtual entertainers over Zoom. Instead of in-person events, we were able to host virtual events like trivia, scavenger hunts, video game tournaments. Our headliner that we had already booked agreed to host an Instagram Live concert, followed by live performances from student DJs via Twitch. Instead of being on campus, we were actually able to partner with a student who had begun making a replica of the Mines campus on Minecraft. So this is not to say that I'm such an amazing leader, look what my team did in the face of crisis, because I know that I made a lot of mistakes. I know I steamrolled plenty of my team, and I can absolutely not take credit for many of the ideas that came to be during that time. What I am saying is that when your team is already so hardworking and dedicated, imagine what they would do if they also had the security of knowing their leaders support them, not just as cogs in the wheel, but as individuals. Imagine how that tension between me and that one individual might have affected the success of the entire team if we had continued to let it fester. And there's a quote from George R.R. Martin that I now think about a lot when I'm trying to remember that people are people, and I'm not the main character in everyone's story. No one is the villain in their own story. If someone's acting some way, they might have a reason for it, and it's probably better to figure out what that reason for it is before assuming they're trying to sabotage your life. And remember to never let any power you are given negatively affect the empathy that you treat the people around you with. In regards to empathy, there is actually a region of the frontal lobe that's called the empathy network. And these regions allow you to detect and understand the emotions of others. And interestingly, individuals that have damage to this part of the brain are often way more impulsive than before that damage was done. They're more prone to feeling disconnected. They're more likely to curse, yell, and engage in insensitive behavior at a higher level than before that damage happened. In neuroscience literature, this is called acquired sociopathy, aka becoming a sociopath as a result of brain trauma. So Dr. Keltner, he's a psychologist out of UC Berkeley. He's done a lot of studies on the effects of gaining power. He defined power for the purposes of these studies as an individual's relative capacity to modify others' states by providing or withholding resources or administering punishment. What he's found is that people who are given a little bit of power over others will often display the same changes in personality as those who had the brain trauma leading to acquired sociopathy. These individuals who have been given more power are more likely to gamble. They're more likely to flirt inappropriately, act rude, swear, just general increases in impulsivity. They kind of stop caring what people think. One of his most notable tests is called the Cookie Monster test. And in this test, they bring 3 students of the same sex into a room. They randomly assign one of them as the leader, and then they give them an intentionally boring task. After a while, someone brings in a plate of 4 chocolate chip cookies. So for those of you doing the math, 3 people, 4 cookies. So there's 1 for everyone, and there's 1 left. And what they found with this study is that more often than not, the person in power is the one that takes the last cookie, the second cookie for themselves. Not only this, they were also more likely to chew with their mouths open, smack their lips while they're eating, and leave a mess of crumbs on like the front of their sweaters or on the table where the cookies were, showing a decreased concern for social norms. About this study, Keltner is quoted saying, "The skills most important to obtaining power and leading effectively are the very skills that deteriorate once we have power. So in order to avoid becoming the cookie monster, you need to practice self-awareness and self-leadership. It's important to remember that while you are a leader, you are still a member of the team. It's important to remember to invest in your relationship with your team. Your team members are people too, and they have their own experiences and lives outside of what you know." So we've talked a lot about my time in college. So what did I do after college? What are you going to do after college? Because I didn't know. Because while I was in college, Mac, Pi-Fi, peer educators, and my coursework had been my whole identity. And I had to revisit that question that I asked all of you, I made you ask me at the beginning of who am I? But in the face of this transition, it really becomes, who do I want to be? And so I looked back on the hobbies that I had previously done, and I decided that I wanted to find a passion project. And hopefully you guys are all on the same page as me in that your work does not need to be your passion project. It absolutely can, but it doesn't need to be. And I was looking for something outside of my professional career. So throughout high school and college, I had always been interested in visual media as an art form. In high school, that manifested as an interest in conceptual and portrait photography. I taught myself via YouTube how to compose, capture, and edit. And I knew this would not end up being a career, but I did recognize that it would probably be a lifelong hobby. And during college and on Mac, I was introduced to graphic design through creating marketing materials and logos. So after college, I knew that I wanted to build on that. So I made a conscious effort to invest in those hobbies. I got myself a Skillshare subscription. I took classes in design, drawing, and typography, and I started doing freelance work as Maia Warner Media. And here are some of the designs that I worked on recently, including a lot of work for Minds that you might have seen at some E-Days past. And in fact, I actually designed the graphics and pamphlets for this very event. But aside from visual media, I've always been interested in other kinds of media. I've always had a bug in my head that I kind of wanted to start a podcast. I was and still am an avid listener of true crime podcasts, but I didn't believe I had anything substantive enough to say that warranted shouting into the void that is today's consumable media. But that didn't mean I'd stopped wanting to learn how to create podcasts. And then one day, I was hanging out with a group of friends, and I was listening to someone that I knew kind of by association named Grant Thomas. I was listening to him tell a story, and I thought, there it is. He's got a personality people would love. We have a good repertoire, and it gives me an excuse on how to learn to produce a podcast. So on a whim, I asked him if he'd maybe maybe want to start maybe making a podcast with me. And he agreed. So we met and discussed potential topics and episode structure and name ideas, and we settled on running a storytelling comedy podcast called Well, I Laughed. We were able to invest $100 each to get some equipment and front some of the publishing costs, and I used my graphic design skills to create our logo and taught myself a bit of music production to create a fun little intro jingle, and voila, podcast. But it wasn't as easy as voila, obviously. I had to learn how to record and edit audio, In fact, actually, the first 2 episodes we ever recorded never saw the light of day because the audio was so bad that nobody could fix it. I even sent it to a professional to try and fix, and they still couldn't do it. So we threw in the towel. I had to admit defeat, and we had to re-record those episodes. I hated admitting defeat. I hated the idea that we weren't going to actually get those genuine first interactions between me and Grant, but I had to keep telling myself that failure is how you learn, and that I wasn't going to be happy publishing something I wasn't proud of. So Grant and I were kind of friends by association at this point, but the first episodes we recorded were in May of 2023. They didn't get published, we recorded them in February, and they were published in May. So that tells you about how long it took me to admit defeat. It was quite a while. Grant and I didn't know each other super well. We joked that our podcast was just an inside joke or a social experiment to see how long we could guilt trip our mutual friends into listening to it. And it was still fun. We had a lot of mutual strengths, and we enjoyed working together. We enjoyed the process of making the podcast, so we kept at it. We eventually started making some reels and TikToks to post on social media, aka more fodder for the void of today's consumable media. And suddenly one goes viral. And our Instagram went from maybe a couple hundred followers to 20,000 in a matter of days. Our TikTok got up to 80,000, all by the time we released episode 7. And thankfully, those social media follows translated to new listeners as well. This is some of our data that I pulled from the release dates of our episodes. So you can see between episodes 5 and 7, our listener base jumped drastically. And I'm not going to lie and say that we found the recipe for success for podcasting. We got incredibly lucky, but there was a lot of work between that. We were able to maintain this listener base because of our own consistency and because we were constantly trying to better understand the industry that we suddenly found ourselves hurtled into. We understood that we needed to love what we were doing for the sake of what we were doing and not just for the numbers. Speaking of the numbers, though, this is what our podcast looks like now. We're almost at 40 episodes. We average around 40,000 monthly listeners and have, between TikTok and Instagram, about 150,000 followers and just over 150 paying patrons, which helps support the costs of producing the podcast. But in truth, it's not all about these numbers, although it does definitely help, don't get me wrong. Grant and I, when we started getting a lot of followers, we had to really quickly evaluate what we wanted our listeners to take away from the episodes, aside from the content that we were actually producing. What did we want our listeners to see in who we were as people? One of my main goals was to continue to promote the destigmatization of mental health, to talk openly about my unique family situation. I am no contact with my parents, and this is not something that I knew that I wanted to talk about. It's still, the emotional wounds are still a little bit fresh, but I recognize that if I were in my shoes and I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts and heard someone talk about being in a familiar situation, it would have made me feel less alone in what I was going through. So I decided to be open about the healing journey of that. So yes, people love the stories, people love the banter, but the most meaningful things to me have been messages like these. And I want to make it clear, I'm not celebrating these people going through rough times. I'm pointing out the fact that we were able to be there for someone in someone's time of that they didn't have a lot positive going on. There's one that says, listening to Maia's stories helps me remember that there are other people navigating an abnormal family situation, but still living happy lives. There's another one, this year has been incredibly tough for me, but when I listen to your podcast, I don't feel as alone anymore. I told myself all those years ago that I wanted to have an impact on how people perceive mental health, and my reach is now farther than it's ever been. There have been messages about my discussions around mental health. I just didn't have a ton of time to go through messages and pull them. But I'm finally able to make that difference in some lives, even if it's only making them feel less alone and more understood. And it's safe to say that through all of this, I have forged a rather unique path for myself. So looking back on the last several years, my life is in a vastly different place than I would have expected as a result of the small decisions and intentional changes that I made along the way. Like my discussions around mental health, that was a small intentional change that I made. Another example is if I hadn't joined MAC, I wouldn't have realized that I liked logistics and I was interested in becoming a project manager and not going into an incredibly technical job. If I hadn't asked Grant to start a podcast with me, kind of on a whim, And despite not knowing him well, I would not have this amazing community of listeners and supporters that I have. So that leads us to our last exercise, and it's going to be two-part. For the first part, I want you to look at where you are today. I want you to consider the journey that you've taken to get here. And I want you to write down a couple, if I hadn't blank, I might not or I would not blank. I want you to see where you are and appreciate the journey that you've taken to get here. Okay, and I'll introduce the second exercise to you as well. I want you to consider back to the first exercise that I asked you to do, of writing down what leaders you admire and the qualities that make them great leaders. And I want you to consider if I were giving this talk to an entirely different group and someone wrote down your name for that answer. What would you hope the attributes are that they would list? Whether or not they're true about you right now, what would you hope that they would list? I want you to write down a couple of active changes that you can make or you can try to start making that will get you closer to the kind of leader you want to be. So a lot of those answers might be kind of personal to you, but I do hope that you consider your answers to those questions the next time you're in a place of transition and you ask yourself, who do you want to become? So just to review, here are some of the takeaways that I hope you take away from this. If you weren't paying attention to my whole speech, now might be a good time. This is my advice on how I forged my path, I guess, and the advice that I would take going forward as myself, even as I continue on this path. You can be a leader outside of a leadership role. You can literally forge your own path. You don't need to be a PM or a team lead in order to engage in these kinds of leadership practices. You can also practice this by defeating the bystander effect and becoming an advocate for others. Be an empathetic leader of your team, first and foremost. Empathy and success are not mutually exclusive, like we saw with Bob Chapman. Invest in your strengths and acknowledge the blind spots. Don't forget these strengths. Don't become the cookie monster when you are given some amount of power or given a leadership position. And also don't fall into the trap of trying to fix your weaknesses instead of focusing on your strengths. Small actions can have really big impacts, so don't fear failure. Anything that you do might have an impact, and the worst that happens is that you try again. And just because something isn't true now doesn't mean it can't be sometime in the future. Oh, and one more thing, if you have a podcast that you want to listen to, I have a really great one that I can recommend. It's called All I Laugh. Anyway, thank you.